Okay, welcome back, everybody. So, when we have been reading the title of this talk during the review, I was having this image in my mind, like a schoolyard bully shaking this little boy and see what it falls out. Nobody likes bullies, but to be honest, we kind of all like bullying Microsoft a little bit. So let's hope that Simon will do exactly that for us. Give him a warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much. I promise I'm not too much for bully, but I might tease Microsoft just a little bit here and then. So yeah, really excited to be back in Troopers. This is such a special conference to me, and I want to thank everyone for their hard work putting this on. Very excited to talk to you today. This is really a story of how I ended up with 1 million lines of Microsoft's proprietary code, and so I'm not accused of burying the lead at all. How we did this was by registering a plugin. So, I'm Simon Maxwell Stewart. I was a physics graduate and have sort of hacked my way into hacking, as it were. I have a pretty fun deal with my employer, which is Phantom Labs, the sort of research division of Beyond Trust, where if I finish up my contributions to the Identity Insights product for the month, then the rest of the month I get to do fun, cool, weird research. It's kind of like when you were younger, if you're told to, you can have dessert if you eat up all your dinner. So I'm very lucky to be able to just mess around trying to do things that I shouldn't be able to do in Azure. Okay, so today we're going to go over what is the Dataverse. If you're anything like me, it's a service you've probably never ever heard of at all. Then we're going to go over what are plugins. We're going to go over how we got system on the box, what fell out, and then really the main thing that I wanted to talk to you today about, which is this architecture called Plex, and how we reversed engineered it, and how it works. And then we'll just end with a few takeaways. Okay, so I like to joke around quite a lot that doing Azure security research feels a lot more like archaeology than anything else. And so this story starts with Salesforce, ironically enough, as any good story should start with. So in 2000, Salesforce was launched, and quite quickly afterwards, Microsoft, I think, decided that they wanted a direct competitor to Salesforce. And so they came up with Dynamics CRM, which often gets called XRM, and that was like an on-prem product. Afterwards, about 4 years later, they introduced the idea of plugins. We're going to go over what those are. And then about 5 years after that, they started moving things over to the cloud. Once they then introduced Power Apps, and we'll go over exactly what Power Apps and the Power Platform is, they decided to separate out the data platform layer, which at the time was called the Common Data Service, and they made that a sort of database / sort of data platform that both the Power Platform and Dynamics could share. In 2018, the Power Platform brand was formalized at Ignite, and then in 2020, the Common Data Service was renamed to Microsoft Dataverse. And in 2021, custom API plugins reached general availability. So that is a lot of names and things to get your head around. I'm way more visual, so this is really the main visual that you need to take, which is, yeah, Dataverse is this data platform sitting beneath Dynamics and Power Platform, and then we have all of the different parts of Power Platform. Power Platform is aimed at low-code to no-code users. So Microsoft likes to call these users citizen developers. So these are people in organizations who want to do like really cool, amazing things and need like tools to be able to do it without coding or with very little coding ability. So probably the one that quite a few folks are starting to hear about these days is Copilot Studio. That was definitely the reason why we kind of went down this whole rabbit hole. Lots of companies at the moment are building their own Copilots, and so we wanted to like understand this like attack surface and how everything was built. as you saw from the archaeology timeline before, there was first the idea of regular plugins, and then afterwards there was the idea of custom API plugins. So regular plugins were just .NET assemblies that could be deployed next to your dynamic CRM environment, and that when there was system events like CRUD events happening on tables, your .NET assembly could respond to that and then, say, update other tables or do whatever it needed, whatever business logic it needed to do. Then they introduced the idea of custom API plugins, which is the architecture that you see in front of you. So the idea is kind of pretty simple, which is that a user is going to come along with a message definition and a .NET assembly. They then deploy that to, say, Dynamics CRM or the Power Platform, and that's then linked to a Dataverse org. There's these two tables inside the Dataverse org, custom API and plugin assembly. And so what then happens is this REST API is deployed. And so when a user or whoever is calling this REST API, that's going to trigger this message that was defined here. And then that's then going to be run against your .NET assembly, which is running in this little sandbox. That's then going to return output, and then that's going to go back to the REST API. So as you can see here, I didn't really explode the diagram much for the Dynamics CRM. Honestly, I still need to learn a lot more about Dynamics. I was really coming at this from the Copilot Studio angle. We're not going to get into the full intricacies of how Copilot Studio works. It is broad and vast. But some of the main ideas that you can see is that you have the agents that you build here are actually their instructions and their metadata are stored in a Dataverse org. And that Dataverse org has a one-to-one relationship with a Power Platform environment. You can see that agents have an identity that they get through their service principal. They used to have app registrations. I think this is now disappearing, and they have the sort of agent blueprints and things like that. Not really relevant to this talk. One thing we are going to just point out here is that agents can have tools, and one of the tools that they can have is custom API plugins, which then will reach back out to a Dataverse org. This doesn't just have to be the Dataverse org that is tied to the agent. It can be any other Dataverse org that the tool creator wants to link up there. So, OK. When I dry run this talk, I definitely found that some of the feedback I received was that there was a lot of names and it was hard to keep track of everything. So just to have a little recap so far of what we've learned. Dynamics CRM was Microsoft's competitor to Salesforce. The Dataverse was carved out of Dynamics CRM to be a generic platform component for Dynamics 365 and Power Platform. Copilot Studio is Microsoft's low-code, no-code AI agent builder. And it's a member of the Power Platform family. And then plugins are just .NET assemblies that live in your Dataverse org and run in response to custom events triggered by a deployed REST API. And those assemblies run in a sandbox. So I think that's pretty much all of the information required, and we can have a bit of fun going forwards. So some of you might have come to this talk hoping that you're not going to be exposed to too much AI content, as we're a little bit flooded with it at the moment in cybersecurity. But really, this talk is much more about that some of these new services are just new names on top of old services, and understanding these old services that these new services have been built on top of is a fruitful way to potentially find interesting new research. OK, so getting system on the box. So I'm giving you guys this from the hindsight of having understood what all of these things are. But for us, the beginning of this rabbit hole was just looking through the Dataverse and seeing that there was this very strange table called plugin assembly. When we looked at it, we realized that there were actually genuinely a bunch of binaries just sitting in a table in base64 format. And that brought up a lot of questions to us immediately. Shout out to my old boss, Fletcher Davis. He was the one who spotted this and thought this might be an interesting attack surface. We then started extracting some of the built-in binaries that were were in an out-the-box Dataverse org, started decompiling them. We wondered, like, do these contain vulnerabilities? Then we just wanted to kind of understand the sort of security model of these plugins, and so we decided to register one. So our idea was a pretty simple one. What if we just have our message definition as just be the request body is just going to be a command that we're going to send, and then that command is going to be sent over to our .NET assembly, and that .NET assembly is just going to call command exe with the commands that we've just posted to it, and then get the output back out. We called this the Echo plugin, and we started probing the box. So let's see it in action. So we spin this up, then we can type in our command, run it, send it to the endpoint. The endpoint has now just run that on the box, and then we got the response from our command. Great. Now, pretty quickly, we realized that we're running into two pretty annoying limitations. So first of all, because we're like running these commands through a REST API endpoint, we have like a timeout that for longer commands was like pretty annoying. And then we also realized when we started doing subsequent demands after like doing things like writing files, that we were sitting in front of a load balancer, and that load balancer was then pinging us between containers in our container pool. And so that was pretty annoying. And so then we were like, hey, time to say goodbye to our Echo plugin. Let's have an Azure storage-based C2. And I fulfilled one of my lifelong goals, which is to build a C2 that the world does not need. So really the motivation is that I assumed that there would be, that the sandbox would be fairly locked down to the internet, and that probably the best chance I had of getting a C2 on there was having it run through the Azure storage, an Azure storage container. And so it's a pretty simple idea. We just use the REST API endpoint to initially deploy our C2 onto a container. After that, it's just going to sit there, polling a storage container. Once we then, as the attacker, are sitting here with our client, we write a command that then gets pulled onto the container, and then when it runs it, it writes the output back where, as an attacker, we can then just get the output from. So this was pretty fun. Let's see that one in action. So as you see, UI's had an upgrade. So first of all, we deploy our C2 agent to the server, to the container. Then this is me in the bottom getting impatient for the deploy. The command is then sitting there. And then in a second, once the deploy happens, OK, great, the C2's on the container. And then, awesome, we've got our result from our command back. So cool. This kind of was all the tooling that we needed to kind of really like explore these boxes. And for the eagle-eye viewers among you, you might have been wondering, like, wait, hang on, who are we? We were definitely pretty surprised that we seemed to be an admin of some kind. And so obviously, we then wanted to look at the privileges of this user. I didn't realize at the time, but this is a fairly standard Hyper-V like user. And you can see here that SE debug privilege is enabled. For those of you who aren't familiar with this privilege, this allows you to dump the memory of any process. So it's pretty powerful. There's a few other interesting privileges knocking around. These were the key ones. We're mostly just going to be talking about the SE debug privilege, but there was also stuff for sort of doing potato attacks and some other things. But for us, this debug privilege was really all we needed. OK, so we're container admin, but it would sure be nice to be system. And I'm a Windows internals noob. I'm like, I'm one of the weirder researchers that understands Azure way more than I understand like Windows internals. And so I was pretty stoked that, yeah, we could actually get like systems. So here we're just defining a service where we have our commands that we're going to run. That's just going to run to some output here, and then we just define that this service should run as local system, aka system, and then we start up the service. This gives an error because this isn't a proper service implementation, but it errors out after it's run our command. So this was pretty cool. I was feeling pretty happy with myself that, privilege escalated from admin to system. And so, went online to see if this was worthy of an MSRC submission, and it turns out it's not. It's, there's quite a lot of ways to get from admin to system. But we are now system on the box, so we can do pretty much whatever we want. So just to quickly recap, we landed on the box as this container admin. This is like a fairly normal thing in Hyper-V, or a standard user in Hyper-V space. That's a member of the administrators group, and then we just escalated to system. OK, so we then decided, OK, what's in this box, and what can we get out of it? And so initially, we were kind of a little bit disappointed because we're system on the box, but this isn't as if this is a box that people are logging into and doing different stuff on. And initially, with the box that we were on, it was recycling about every 30 minutes. I think that's because we were on a dev Power Platform environment. When I tried this out on production Power Platform environments, the box definitely seems to last longer. I'm not sure exactly how often they recycle, but I've seen my box hanging around for a few days at a time. So it can definitely vary. OK, so things definitely got a little bit more interesting. We managed to pull a live TLS certificate off. This was good for 6 months, but still a little bit academic and theoretical. The real prize was getting these DLLs off the box. We had a look through immediately to kind of see, are these DLLs that are sort of used publicly in SDKs and things that are distributed? And when we did that and cross-checked that across the internet, that only ruled out 7 of them. And we realized 209 of them were internal proprietary ones that had never been made public before, at least to our knowledge. That ended up being about 1 million lines of decompiled C#. And to give you a little bit of a sense of what was in there, we found some hard-coded secrets, which was great. Lots of key vault configs that certainly don't seem to be public, and a few more juicy details. So we then began reverse engineering our haul. From looking at these DLLs, we started realizing that they were describing this thing called Plex architecture. Googling what that was didn't reveal anything online. And then it's at this point that I realized this is what I wanted my Troopers talk to be about. It seems like no one has documented this architecture, what the security boundaries look like, and how it functions. And so this is the main thing that I want to talk to you today. We also noticed that there was these gRPC contracts. And so some other questions we had was well, can we go probe that gRPC layer? Do these DLLs just have any vulnerabilities in them? And then do they leak any sensitive information? OK, so thankfully, I don't have to sacrifice too many goats to the demo gods, as my demo is just a static website. If you want to follow along, you can feel free to open this up on your own phone. If you're brave enough to scan a QR code from a hacker, then you can just scan that to get. But we're going to go over to the tool that we built. OK, so we're going to follow along the flow from a plugin execution standpoint. So at the top, we have the platform. This is the cloud. This is the Dataverse application itself. And so it dispatches plugin execution requests, and it dispatches those down to the gateway. The gateway is just this intermediary layer. It runs as this thing called the Sandbox Manager service. And then when it receives a plugin execution request from the platform, it's then going to call a worker. So the worker sits there. This is where we got container administrator privileges on one of these boxes. And as you can see, one of the first things to notice is different plugins that we deploy end up on the same worker. So all the workers in the container pool end up getting the same plugin. That's going to be important a little bit later. And then there is, I think, what is the most interesting part of this architecture, which is the sidecar. The sidecar contains all of the configuration that the worker needs, and it is definitely more privileged than the worker. Understanding the Hyper-V architecture was also a little complex and involved. Initially, I thought that it sat outside of the Hyper-V boundary. It does actually sit inside of it technically, but they are separated by a partition. So the sidecar is the host partition, and then the worker is the guest partition. I'm still learning a lot more about the Hyper-V, but we can, sorry, small thing to click on, but you can actually, with this tool, go pull up a bit of information about this. I did try probing this layer. So far, nothing has worked, but spoiler, you can still get system on these boxes, so I'm still going to keep on trying a few things. It's an interesting attack service to me. If you're interested in seeing some of the things that we tried, you can pull that up. Now, there's a few more things to note. The gateway actually will dispatch calls using this nonce. So the worker gets a nonce, and that's how the gateway routes calls to the right worker. Now, when I was reverse engineering this, I suddenly understood the security model and how the security, the Sandbox devs had moved the security boundary off of the box. So if we take a look at the plugins, we realize that there's these interesting API calls like the Key Vault client and other things. Those things that these clients and API calls that are privileged don't actually really happen on the box at all. They all go through this choke point called the Sandbox callback service, and then that calls the gateway, which then relays that up to the platform, and then this is where the privileged things are actually going to happen. I tried doing all kinds of things to acquire a token. I looked at calling IMDS. There was no such way to get a token. I tried using seeing if I could just sit in memory, stealing any token that came through. As far as I'm aware, and from reverse engineering this box, I don't think that tokens actually come into the box. As I say, I think all the interesting privilege stuff happens here. Now, we did also, using those DLLs, we managed to build a working gRPC executable in Go. So we took these definitions and then started seeing what things that we could speak to. Not everything actually did what was implemented. It seems like there's a difference between first-party plugins and the plugins that we were deploying on the box. So I think if you're a first-party plugin, some of these things do work, whereas being a third-party plugin, they didn't seem to. However, this get environment variables was definitely a really interesting call. It returned things that we didn't have just on the environment variables on the worker itself. We will get to that in a second. If you're interested, this is all released, the gRPC probe, as part of our tooling that we're releasing with this project. So what held? So I want to give, before I'm accused of any bullying, I want to give Microsoft their dues that generally this architecture was super strong. This idea of just turning all the services into just hollow wrappers that proxy everything through this callback service was really annoying. A lot of the most obvious things that we tried didn't work. That's how they moved the security boundary off of the box. the services for making tokens, as I said, like there's a difference between the plugins, so it seems like only first-party plugins can do that. And that's when I realized, okay, the worker is more of a jail than like an identity. And so for anyone following my footsteps, yeah, I think you'll probably run into the same roadblocks. However, just because this part was strong doesn't mean that like there are no security issues. So as promised, we did find this in the code. So as you can see here, Bing Maps API key. I tried out this API key against Bing Maps, and sure enough, like it works. So that was pretty great. But mostly, it confirmed to me a hypothesis that I was like starting to build in my head. And remember that timeline of the archaeology slide at the beginning? That wasn't just kind of some soft, fluffy context. That is actually like central to my hypothesis of what I think happened here. I believe that the original plugin devs didn't expect us to be system on the box. I believe what happened was that some Sandbox architecture devs came along, realized, hey, these are all the privileged API calls. Let's just make use of the fact that those are just have interfaces, and then we'll just replace the implementation beneath those interfaces, and then that way they just move things off the box that way. Now, I have seen this kind of pattern happen a few times on some things that I've done some security audits. I like to call it the cloud lift and shift. So have something that was on-prem, you shift it over to the cloud. So one thing is there are anti-patterns when you go from treating servers as pets to cattle. There are things that, that you maybe shouldn't be in images. Then the code itself really broadens the attack surface. It reveals like all of the inner working of the box. As you saw, it reveals like hard-coded secrets and non-public infrastructure topology, as well as these undocumented API calls. So we found these lying around like everywhere. There's like a lot more I could like share. This is the kind of stuff that like I felt comfortable sharing. So there was these like sovereign cloud configurations and like their key vault URLs. There was like tons of these knocking around, as well as like the app IDs, presumably for like how these things are acquiring tokens. This isn't in any way sufficient for like creating tokens, but if you're say like APT and wanting to skip out a bunch of like recon, like brute force like recon, now suddenly you have like GUIDs and key vault URLs that would probably assist in your attack somewhat. Okay, cross-tenant. This was like something we obviously tried. So when we were looking at the DLLs, we realized it did have these cross-tenant isolation application level checks. And so that got us really excited because we were like, hey, well, we can easily, as we can just patch the memory, we can just like confuse the box into thinking what kind of organization it is, which then achieved some cross-tenant like code execution, but only at the container layer. As soon as these calls went up to the platform, the gateway revalidated our org identity independently, presumably using that nonce, and realized that like, hey, this worker isn't actually this organization ID. Now, things did get a little bit interesting. As I said, that get environment variables return things that weren't just environment variables on our worker box. This was confirmed by Microsoft, who said that these were outside the trust boundary of the org. When I then said, well, surely that means that they're cross-tenant, they never got back to me. My logic is pretty straightforward, which is that, say I'm a Power Platform administrator, I can deploy Power Platform environments. So there's a one-to-many relationship between there, and then there's a one-to-one linking of Dataverse orgs. So sort of by definition, a Dataverse org can only have one tenant associated with it. And yeah, we checked. We found tons of these. We only have 6 orgs, so by basic math, when we got 43 of these, some of these have to be coming from not our organization. And only one of them, the box that we were on, was that. So it seemed to be from this instrumentation logging endpoint where there's a map of the instrumentation keys to the organization IDs. And again, if there's no further proof, for a little bit of extra proof, like we weren't running this from the US Gov, so this does seem to be leaking organization IDs from other tenants. So would love to hear back from Microsoft as to exactly why they think this is cross-org but not cross-tenant, but I think from my understanding this is cross-tenant. Okay, I think like it's kind of stepping back for kind of like the things that probably most customers are going to be concerned about here, especially thinking about that this is a low-code, no-code kind of solution, is going to be the cross-plugin attack. When we submitted the initial Sandbox escape, Microsoft closed the ticket as low severity and said that the scenario would only impact the attacker's own workload. Now, it is true that you need to be a system admin, that's like an RBAC role of the Power Platform environment, or a system customizer of that environment, which are both quite privileged roles. But it is also important to note that these plugins are sitting next to like one another, and like because if we have a malicious plugin here that can dump any process memory, it can now go like attack another process. So let's go take a look at that in action. We registered 2 plugins. So one plugin is, say, handling some like nice private, like sensitive, like information, and then the other plugin just scans in memory, and then you can see it's managed to pick up these payloads that were going through the box. We wondered, like, is this like more of a like theoretical attack? How would this actually like work in practice? I think like the biggest danger, like attack surface that we can see coming from this is the like there's a very thriving marketplace. So just a bit of a classic supply chain attack. These are just some of the things that applied. You can see here there's 12,000 results we got for Dynamics 365. So yeah, there's people are definitely using these kind of plugins. It is a healthy ecosystem. I tried to see if I could get any numbers on like how many organizations were actually using these things. I don't know. All I know is from the amount of apps that seems to be being used quite a lot. Now, to go back to Copilot Studio for a second, agents definitely amplify this risk because they have this tool of this custom API plugin. And so if a agent is then using this tool, any plugin that's like sitting in the same environment would be able to start like stealing data and things that's going through that tool call. We did manage to pull some data on how many people seem to be using Copilot Studio. So Microsoft's own numbers are 230,000 organizations and like 90% of the Fortune 500. And so, as you can see here, this is how you set up the tool call. And like we do actually get to choose the environment. So it's not just limited to the specific environment either. OK, so to get Microsoft's response on this, we submitted the initial Sandbox escape and gRPC sidecar access, including the cross-org or cross-tenant information leak. They closed it out a month later, saying this would only impact the attacker's own workload. We then submitted a ticket to detailing the cross-plugin attack immediately afterwards, as we felt that wasn't owned by the attacker and wanted to get their take on that. We then, MSC asked for a blog write-up, and we responded. We were happy to share that with a deadline. We then submitted another ticket detailing credential exposure and information disclosed in the DLLs. Then there was another couple of things that we also submitted that we can't talk about today, unfortunately, but stay tuned. The story doesn't quite end here. And then, yeah, we reminded them of the feedback deadline, and unfortunately, they didn't respond. Now, looking at their response, I do think like we did actually break their stated boundary. We went trawling through their docs, This is what they had to say about plugins on the write a custom Azure Aware plugin. So at the bottom here, you can see it says no other external access, such as access to a local file system, is allowed. I really don't understand why this sentence is there. They certainly make it seem from all of the documentation that we could read that these things did have boundaries and guardrails in place. And I think that someone in Microsoft does agree with this, because when we came back to check just before the docs, they had silently removed this last line, which is good and is like a step in the right direction. But maybe this is where I'm going to, put my bullying hat on. I took an attempt to write their docs for them, so there are no meaningful restrictions when you register an Azure Aware custom plugin. The container is a hostile multi-tenant environment. The plugin executes as container administrator with trivial escalation to system, with full read-write access to the local file system, SE debug privilege over all processes, and unrestricted outbound internet access. Now, in case I get accused of putting words in Microsoft's mouth, this was their actual quote. As discussed, the container is treated as a hostile multi-tenant environment within our security model. I actually think this was probably the most interesting thing I got out of this whole research, that they put this in writing. As I say, nowhere on the docs can I see that this is the security model. In fact, lots of the docs seems to soothe users that there are, in fact, restrictions on plugins. So I think from a customer point of view, this would be the main thing to take away, which is these containers are hostile and multi-tenant environments, apparently, which is a little alarming to me. OK, defense. So for customers, yeah, we're having a year when it comes to supply chain attacks. So I think that supply chain attack does need to be taken seriously. You might want to consider segmenting your Power Platform environments, especially if you're just trying different plugins off the internet, off of different marketplaces. I would review the code carefully of any marketplace plugin. Another thing that I hear quite a lot with Copilot Studio and Power Platform is like, oh no, we don't let users build like agents in our tenant. That's often not quite the case. Copilot Studio and Power Platform has this idea of a default environment. So anyone with a license to use the product is automatically going to end up in that environment as an environment maker. And so you may think that you haven't given them any direct access, but these licenses are given out like candy kind of thing. At this time, you can go get a trial license, and even after your trial expires, your agents are still like usable for, I think, 90 days after the trial expires. So if you are trying to defend from kind of low-code, no-code users just YOLOing their own agents, definitely there are some ways of locking down that default access. Unfortunately, you have to do quite a few different things. OK, ask from Microsoft. As I say, the Hyper-V boundaries and a lot of the security model I massively respect and think was really strong. The hole in all of this that I still don't understand is why user plugins run as like effectively system on the box. I say this because a typical pattern that is used in a lot of Sandbox is that even if the worker needs to have some kind of admin privilege, you fork the process, you downgrade the privileges, you run the user-supplied code. I don't understand why user-supplied code has to be running with essentially system-level privileges, and I think that would be a really easy win. But obviously, I'm not on the other side of things, so I don't know. But I can say that it would have stopped every single attack that we successfully got on the box, including the ones that we're not able to disclose today. The other ask I would say is that Microsoft don't seem to be informing customers of their own internal threat model. And if they can make that public, I think customers would benefit. So, to conclude, we've learned that Dynamics CRM and like the Dataverse were born out of each other. The Power Platform and Copilot Studio sit on top of the Dataverse too. hopefully, you've come away learning a little bit about how plugins work. We've learned about how the Plex Sandbox architecture works, how the security boundaries were moved off of the box, but the residual problems with this sort of cloud lift and shift approach. And then I hope if you're a defender in the audience, you've taken away a little bit of a respect for the supply chain risk. So as of this time, I don't have any CVE, which is a little bit sad, but I'm consoling myself with the fact I have free Bing Maps API access for life. Thank you very much, everybody.
Are you taking questions?
Oh, yeah.
If there are any.
Great talk. You mentioned like first-party plugins. Are they running in the same container?
Yeah. They don't seem to be. I will say that MSRC was incredibly nervous about this aspect when I jumped on a call with one of their chief security architects. For all the evidence that I could see was that they don't appear to be in the same box. There is also, I did try and spoof being a first-party plugin once I realized that they were treated differently, and they have something, I think it's the Trusted Platform Service or something where, yeah, it's this register that they have on the platform side that like checks the signature of plugins. So yeah, I wasn't able to spoof one.
All right, thanks.
So you mentioned that there's still something that you can't disclose, which means I guess there's a lot more to this issue than you mentioned in this talk.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't disclose.
Yeah. Okay, which means your suggestion for defense should be taken very seriously if people are working with plugins.
Yeah, I mean, my personal opinion is that they that until, yeah, I think until that they remove system from the box, they're playing with fire a little bit. For instance, something I can disclose is that I am certainly going to keep on probing the Hyper-V boundary. I'm trying to learn as fast as I can. I'm thankful to have a new boss called Jonathan Johnson, who's like a pretty big time kind of Windows internals guy. I was like getting his take on the kind of Hyper-V boundary. He was like, you know, it's strong, but then as soon as you have like any kind of like porosity, like as soon as anything can go in and out of like a partition boundary, you know, that starts causing problems, and that quite often you can then find your way through. So there's 2 ports that I found open. There's obviously the gRPC port. There's like a monitoring shim. There are some other avenues that like I'm exploring, and I certainly think like those would all just be immediately shut down if I didn't have like system on the box. So yeah.
So I'll be waiting for the CVE then. Thank you.
All right, thanks, guys. Yeah, if you want, we've just dropped the blog today. Follow us at Phantom Labs for hopefully news of where the story carries on. And here's the link to the architecture tool. And if you want our C2 and our Echo plugin, as well as the gRPC stuff, you can get it in our tooling repo. Thanks, guys.